Do you remember that one episode of Friends where Phoebe finds a thumb in her drink and gets a bunch of money for the distress it caused her? Well, that wasn't just a thing of fiction, but it has happened in real life too. Just in this case, it wasn't a thumb, but a dead snail. Today, I will be talking about the Donoghue v. Stevenson case, which is not only a really interesting case because it involves a dead snail, but also because it was very important for determining duty of care in negligence cases. The case goes something like this. One day in Scotland, a woman, Donoghue, was out with her friend and bought a bottle of ginger beer to enjoy. She opened it and drank it until she realized there was something floating in there. Upon closer inspection, she found it was a decomposed snail in her drink. After drinking this ginger beer, she became ill and eventually sued the manufacturer of the bottled ginger beer. Now one may think, shouldn't your first thought be to sue the seller, the cafe owner? But consider this, the bottle was opaque, and there was no way for Donoghue or the cafe owner to know what was in the bottle when they bought it. And since the owner bought it from the manufacturer, in this case, the only one who would know what was in the bottle before it was opened would be the manufacturer. Prior to this case, negligence cases were based on contractual relationships between the seller and the consumer. In that case, under contract law, Donoghue would not be able to sue the manufacturer because technically there was no proximity, no direct contractual relationship between Donoghue and the manufacturer. However, the lawyers in this case argued something called a neighbor principle that states a person owes a duty of care to those that are closely and directly affected by their actions. In this case, the manufacturer had a duty of care because their actions and products had potential to harm the consumer if there was something wrong with the drink. The court, or in this case the House of Lords, held that Stevenson, the manufacturer, owed a duty of care to the consumer and that he had breached this duty of care, making him liable for negligence. Remember that the criteria for whether duty of care exists includes foreseeability of harm, proximity of relationship between parties, fairness, justice, and reasonableness of imposing duty of care, standard of care required of a person that is a reasonable person in the same circumstances. In this case, the manufacturer was found negligent because it was reasonably foreseeable that a decomposed snail could end up in a bottle and cause illness if someone drank it, and it was fair, just, and reasonable to impose that duty of care on Stevenson because his actions as the manufacturer of the product could harm the consumer. And since the manufacturer had breached duty of care, he was held liable for the consequences of negligence. Now you may be thinking, what does a snail in a bottle have to do with healthcare? Well, believe it or not, negligence cases are terrifyingly common and possible in the healthcare setting. The main thing that ties this case and healthcare together is negligence and the duty of care. The narrow definition of negligence in law is a breach of standard of care for a professional. It is important to know the difference between negligence and mistakes because in healthcare, people make a lot of mistakes. This case is especially important for healthcare because it determined the definition of negligence and the role of duty of care in negligence cases. This case helped establish the definition of duty of care and understand who owes duty of care to patients in a healthcare setting under various circumstances. Because of this case, we now recognize duty of care as the responsibility or legal obligation of a person or organization to avoid acts or omissions that could likely cause harm to others. In the context of the healthcare system, it is the legal obligation of a healthcare provider to provide care to their patients that meets the established standards for their role. Considering the neighbor principle, duty of care was now owed to whoever may be closely or directly affected by one's actions. And this current definition is what is used for negligence cases today. Considering that this duty of care clause holds providers responsible for the care of patients, it also holds the power to ensure the safety and protection of patients against the actions of doctors that may harm the patient. That basically means this case has put an importance on the impact of professionals' actions on others, which is essential in healthcare where such actions are associated with life or death decisions. The Donoghue and Stevenson case has implications for the duty of care clause regarding negligence cases, and thus has implications for how the healthcare system protects patients and ensures their trust in the system. This case does have implications for the healthcare system overall and its ability to protect patients, but it also has an impact on patients within the healthcare system. You may be wondering, what does law and duty of care and all that stuff have to do with me, a patient? Well, this case and what it stands for is especially important for patients, since oftentimes they are the victims in negligence cases against the healthcare system. The case I talked about concluded that duty of care does not have to rely on a contractual relationship, and that if someone's actions could cause foreseeable harm to you, they owe you a duty of care. This means that if a person's actions do cause foreseeable harm to you, they may be liable for negligence against you. This is something that is important for patients to know when they walk into a healthcare facility. Take the Poor v. Providence healthcare case, for example, where a patient with a history of suicidal ideation was found injured in their locked bathroom. In this case, the nurses that were on duty were found negligent for not observing the patient at appropriate intervals of time and not knowing how to open the bathroom door from outside. While there were 3 nurses on the shift, only 2 were found liable for negligence. This is because the 3rd nurse was on break at that time and technically was not on active duty, thus she was excused. However, the other 2 nurses did owe the patient the duty of care, and since they did not act according to the established standard of care, they were held liable for negligence. It is important for patients to know who has a duty of care towards them and who would be responsible or liable for the harm that is caused to them under a given circumstance. Duty of care is essential for understanding who is responsible for your care as a patient and who to hold responsible to ensure you get justice if something goes wrong. This is why the Donoghue v. Stevenson case is so important, because it outlined what duty of care meant in the context of negligence cases, and it impacted how negligence cases are handled in terms of the healthcare system.